basically what Jethro told Moses what to do.
I want to know what we can do to regain our states' rights.
The application of the 10th Amendment, I think it's into the Constitution, but from the, it all stems around private property rights and state sovereignty, doesn't it?
Well, you know, the Obamacare decision that Justice Roberts wrote, Chief Justice Roberts wrote, had an interesting line. It says that, you know, obviously he upheld Obamacare, called the mandated tax, and saved it. But he did say something interesting on the Medicaid expansion part, where he threw it back to the states to either accept it voluntarily or reject it with no consequence in terms of the loss of federal funding. He said, look, states are independent sovereigns, sometimes they have to act like it. And, you know, so the reality is that state sovereignty has not been effectively wielded for good purposes since the founding era, really. I mean, until recent years, when the Tea Party movement started organizing and people really started to reawaken about state sovereignty, it had largely been utilized to preserve the vestiges of slavery, which gave it a bad name. It was never really the purpose of state sovereignty. The purpose of state sovereignty was to balance ambition against ambition and to provide us with a institution we could resort to check and balance Washington when it was out of control. And the founders designed that deliberately for the states to occupy as much space as we wanted them to draw a fight, to make it politically costly, and maybe even legally a losing case for the federal government to overreach. So how do you revive state sovereignty? Well, you start by using it for the right reasons. You start by using it to define, or I shouldn't say define, to codify our freedoms, to, you know, exert itself like we have with the Healthcare Freedom Act, to say we should have the freedom to choose our medical providers and insurance carriers. And even if we ultimately lose that battle, we have put a line in the sand, we have made it politically costly, more so than without using state sovereignty. And we've built a legal case that forces people to think about these issues, that tends to educate. Another example, besides the propositions that we've got pending, there's the Montana Firearms Freedom Act. There's also the NSA Resistance, the Privacy Act that Senator Kelly Ward advanced last session, where basically she was going to protect, as a matter of state sovereign right, our privacy from NSA surveillance. You know, this is the key. Start using state sovereignty to put a wall around all of the infinite rights that are protected by the liberties identified in the Bill of Rights.
One other bill that I don't remember who suggested it last session, but in essence, there was a bill that was proposed. It didn't really go anywhere, but it was proposed where Arizona would not accept any more federal dollars if it had strings attached. So, in other words, that's the federal government saying, if you want these dollars, you must do this, that, or the other. One of the very final grievances, in the list of grievances, there's the small section that's aimed specifically at the Parliament. So whenever it says he has, well, that was King George that did something wrong. And then whenever it says for doing something, that was the Parliament that did something wrong. The very last one of those is for suspending our own legislatures and declaring themselves invested with power to legislate for us in all cases whatsoever. The reason that I used air quotes is because that was a direct line from a bill that Parliament passed. So Parliament from England said, okay, we're writing this bill, and basically what you do doesn't matter. We're going to legislate all the way, 2,000 miles away or 5,000 miles away, whatever the number is. We're going to legislate for you in all cases whatsoever. That's a direct line. So basically, Thomas Jefferson did a copy and paste and put that in the Declaration. But because Parliament did that, because that was in the Declaration of Independence, that is why we have the 10th Amendment. So that list of grievances, there are lots of circumstances where that list of grievances, because of one of those grievances, that's one of the reasons that we have parts and pieces of the Constitution. I was going to cite other examples, but yeah, supporting the bill that says, hey, any federal dollars that we get from the federal government, make sure there's no strings attached. That also would be something good to support and endorse and propagate through the state.
My view, I guess, is a little more practical on this. We have to take the House, the Senate, and the presidency. It begins there. Before we get that, everything else will be fundamentally irrelevant. And the reason is that that is where the decisions are being made. And the Supreme Court, the composition of the Supreme Court is vital. And very shortly, there's going to be some changes, and we have to have that control so that we can do things which support the states' rights. This, when we talk about the money, I was thinking about that just the other day. They're talking about, giving, when they pass out money, there's all these strings attached. I went to a religious educational institution, and I was scratching my head saying, what effect will that have on that institution? Will it be able to survive? Because they want religion out. Well, what we have to do is, if we're going to have what he's talking about, and they're both right, they're both far more scholarly than I, but I'm just kind of a grassroots guy, we got to take back the Senate. We've got to have people who will start to respond to us. Now, right now, we're so involved in the battle with the liberal side that we're missing the opportunity we have to get the good people to vote for what we want. Let's take back the Senate. Let's take back let's take control of the House as we already have it. Let's get the presidency, and then we get some bills out there, and we can start to establish state rights and dissipate the authority.
Let me just resist and maybe try to persuade you away from that viewpoint to some extent. We had Ronald Reagan, government grew. We had the contract with America, government grew. We had Bush in the presidency, we had a majority on the Supreme Court, we had a majority of the House and the Senate, government grew like it never did before. The idea that focusing all of our efforts on taking control of Washington is the solution is disproven by history. The structure that we have right now is an imbalance and a concentration of too much power in Washington. And no matter who we put in Washington, those people will be corrupted because they are surrounded by special interests. They are distant from us. Within months, they're corrupted in most cases, and they're lost to us. The only thing that we can rely on is the proximity and the earliness of the careers of state legislative officials, because they pragmatically depend more on us than John McCain ever will, or any of his successors ever will, for their own ambition. And so I would challenge with every ounce of my being the idea that our focus needs to be on Washington. Our focus needs to be balancing Washington. Our focus needs to be seizing as much power as we can extract from state sovereignty to change the focus out of Washington, to counterbalance Washington, to make Washington's life difficult so that they have to constantly look in the rearview mirror before they do anything. And critical to this, folks, is using the state-originated amendment power, because nothing else is going to get Washington's attention like amending the Constitution to reinstate things like the pre-17th Amendment and pre-16th Amendment world. So anyway, I just encourage you to think about
Let
that.
me challenge that in one respect. When I learned to walk, I took baby steps. And you cannot get here until you get here. You have to take steps at a time. And I'm not saying we shouldn't be doing what you're suggesting, but the reality is that as long as Washington is controlled the way it is today, and parenthetically, it's run by the bureaucracy, which is fundamentally corrupt. At times, to be honest with you, at times I wonder if it makes any difference who's back there. But the reality is, if we can't take control of those things and start to move forward, realistically, what are we going to do? It's not going to happen. We're going to have a revolution.
I'm not saying ignore Washington. I'm saying let the states lead. Make Washington reactive to what we do here. Bring the fight here, an exact political punishment at a minimum, and an outside chance of enforcing some of the good case law that we've had developing on the state sovereignty front as well.
Well, I agree with that, but let me throw one question out to you. Let's take what's happening right now with the IRS and those types of things. Have you stopped and wondered if we'll ever get a special prosecutor to look at the IRS? Whether I'm Republican or Democrat, I would want that looked at, because it's a matter of time the Republicans are going to be in charge. how will you ever get those things solved unless you have an Attorney General who has the integrity? And that means we have to get people with integrity who has the guts to stand up and say, you know what, this is wrong. Okay, I got it.